terrible, terrible music. But how do I work with this? My thesis is that Christchurch is the best place to live if you think you're having a heart attack, and I know it is, because now you all know how to save a life. 3 fingers deep, whiskey drinkers, pump, 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 120 times a minute. My ED colleague tells me if you don't crack a rib, you're not pumping hard enough. Kia ora, koutou katoa, ko John Pickering toka wangoa, and I'm a scientist, and I'm not going to talk about that kind of heart attack. That kind that you've just saved somebody's life with is called a cardiac arrest. That's when there's no pulse. The type I'm going to talk about is when there is a pulse, at least to start with, and you get this heaviness and chest pain, and you end up going to the emergency department. To do that, I want you to imagine yourselves back in the noughties. 2007 to be exact. Maybe the day before the world changed. And you've got chest pain. And you turn up to the emergency department here, ED, that's an in word, ED. You turn up to ED, and this is what used to happen to you sometime in the noughties. Firstly, you were triaged, and then you started to see the nurses and the doctors, and there were lots of them, and they did measurements, they took blood, they got their cardiology colleagues involved, and you waited. Then you might have had to go and do an exercise test, I'm sure you all love that, to stress the heart. You've gone in there with a heart problem, you've got to stress it. Yeah, that's a good idea, isn't it? Then you had to wait more, in bed, overnight, wait. Am I having a heart attack? I still don't know. My family don't know. Next day, oh, you're not having a heart attack, and you can go home. That was the case in 2007 for 93% of the people who would turn up in the emergency department having chest pain. In Christchurch here, 130,000 people turn up to the ED a year. Maybe 10,000 of them are turning up with chest pain. Back in 2007, 93 out of 100 would spend a night in hospital, but only 10% of them, 10 out of 100, 10 or 15%, were actually having a heart attack. So that's a lot of time, it's unnecessary in the hospital, chance for cross-infections, all kinds of things could be happening. And so, back around then, this little happy chappy on the left here is Dr. Martin Tan. He's an ED specialist, and he thought, well, we know the things that are related to having a heart attack. The electrical activity, measured by electrocardiogram, the ECG, if that's dodgy, more likely to be having a heart attack. Some of your risks, some of your past history, if you had a heart attack before perhaps, and then the signs and symptoms, how you present, what kind of pain you have, those things are related to whether you're having a heart attack or not. And then what we measure in the blood, especially something called troponin. Troponin is really specific to heart muscle being damaged. And so that kind of heart attack where it hurts, it's not stopped, what's going on, those things can go together. But how? That was the question. How do you put them together? When you do, you end up with something called a diagnostic pathway. That's ED speak for a recipe, or an algorithm if you happen to be a tech nerd. So we need to design algorithms in order to decide who and who isn't having a heart attack. And what we want to do especially is decide who's not, as many of those who are not, and get them out of the ED as quickly as possible, reassuring them, reassuring their family, and freeing up resources. So what have we got to do? We've got to be accurate and precise. Accurate on the left, precise on the right. Do you know, I reckon The easiest algorithm is if I go and stand at the front door of the emergency department, anybody coming in with chest pain, I send them home. Because I'll be 90% accurate. Cool, eh? Right, not very precise. So we've got to be both. That's both. And by the way, if you see me with a bow and arrow, be careful. So another way of looking about that, and it just says false because it's dropped off the bottom. On your left, you're pregnant when you're not pregnant when they obviously are. That's a false negative. You're not having a heart attack when they are. That's a false negative. We've got to make that minimal, and we have a standard that we get that right 99 times out of 100 at least for the heart attacks. But we then have to minimise after that the false positives, the people who get sent to the cardiologist or sent into hospital and told you might be having a heart attack when they're not. We want to minimise that. We can't get rid of that entirely. That's the false positives. So that's the goal. So what did Dr. Tan do? Well, these haven't translated very well. We begin what in the middle is called a learning healthcare system, and imagine a big circle. You collect data, you get insights from the data, you do some fancy statistics and modelling and the boring stuff, right? Then you look at how that could be applied in the emergency department, and that's the knowledge translation. And then you get a new pathway, a new algorithm, and you do it again. So in 2007, he started collecting data. 2010, first application, first randomised control trial of its kind in the world, here in Christchurch Hospital, was something called the ADAPT pathway. And the ADAPT pathway allowed people to measure the troponin twice at 0 and 2 hours. Not 6 hours as it was previously, but 0 and 2 hours. It integrated the risk factors and it integrated your electrocardiograms. And we went from 7% of people who could go home from the ED to 18%. But that algorithm, the risk side of it, actually just used something off the shelf that had nothing to do with the ED. It was more to do with predicting mortality for heart attack people. So Dr. Tan and his colleagues came up with something new called EDAX, Emergency Department Assessment of Chest Pain Score, and ran the world's second randomised control trial, and found that now 35% of people could be reassured within the emergency department and go home safely. Then, thanks to the manufacturers of these troponin assays, they could measure it more precisely at much lower concentrations. And that meant that there was a cohort of 30% or so who we could say, you're not having a heart attack after only one blood measurement. So they could be sent home even earlier and reassured even earlier, and the ED was less crowded. But then COVID came along, of course, and people said to us, oh, can you get rid of more people out of ED who aren't having a heart attack? And so we found another low-risk group, not as low as the lowest low-risk group, but a bit low. And we said, belts and braces, you can go home now, but tomorrow go to your GP or elsewhere and get another blood test just in case. So we got more people out of the emergency department safely. Now we're looking at 65, 70% of people out. But it's not over yet. 1st of August last year, a new thing happened in Christchurch ED that hadn't happened elsewhere. And that is thanks to the manufacturers coming along and taking their big boxes that sit over in labs, measuring this troponin and taking an hour to get the data back to the physicians so they can make decisions. They have now got a little box that does the same thing, that can sit in the emergency department and give a result in 8 to 15 minutes. So earlier decisions can be made. And so those earlier decisions can get people assessed quicker, and a whole lot of them, 40% or more, out very early from the emergency department. Because we know that people in the emergency department, when they don't need to be there, are at risk. although you have chest pain, go there. Okay, so this is, what's with your thing? I don't know. Okay, so you've got a chest pain score, you've got the electrical activity, and you've got troponin. If all of them are low in the green, you can go home. Any one of them is high in the red, you'll end up having to spend a night in the hospital. And this is a graph. Can you see the red line going up, squiggly bit? These are ED presentations to, presentations to the emergency department at Christchurch Hospital from the year 2000, when there were about 50-odd thousand, to 2022, 100-odd thousand, more than 100. Dropping bits, that's the earthquake and COVID, and then you've got the bit below which shows those who are being admitted to hospital from the emergency department. The red bit at the top left, where it's shooting up, that's what politicians call not a crisis. But look at this, cardiology, admissions to cardiology during the same period. They started going up, but because of what we've done, they've gone down again. They're actually below back to levels not seen since last millennium. And why? Because the patients that they diagnosed, and this is cardiology speak for, we haven't a clue what's going on, but it's not a heart attack. They call it unspecified chest pain. They were going up. We applied these algorithms in the ED. They stopped seeing some of those patients. And again, numbers back the same as they were last millennium, despite the increases in people. So, wait, there's more. Red line is, say, it's a average length of stay for people being tested with a troponin. Yellow line is after that point of care troponin. 1st of August last year, saving 30 minutes per patient, which is a huge saving when you're talking about 10,000 patients in Christchurch alone. We're going to spread this news to all the country, and we're going to apply it in other EDs, in hospitals, in rural hospitals and GPs, and in fact, it'll spread around the world, making a large difference. So this is where it was in 2007, 93% of people having to spend a night in hospital, only 10% of people having a heart attack. This is where it is now. Much smaller percentage, maybe 30 or 40% of that spend a night in hospital, only 10% having a heart attack, and those who are in the ED are being assessed more quickly and being able to leave more quickly. So that was my thesis, that if you're going to think you're having a heart attack, the best place to be right now in the world is Christchurch. Thank you very much.
Hello. Oh, yeah, there we go. Thank you so much, John. Who has questions? I'll pass you the microphone.
Do you have numbers for false negatives? Was there an increase of it, or do you?
No increase. We tailor the algorithms to make sure, it's a good question, we make sure we never go beyond 99, beyond getting 1 out of 100 wrong, but in fact, when we look at the data over tens of thousands of patients, it's actually much less than that. That's because the doctors actually know what they're doing, believe it or not.
Thanks for that. So what's the next big opportunity to cut the false positives even further?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're going to get, as you improve algorithms like this, it actually gets harder and harder to make changes. The big change, I think, in terms of speed, is these little boxes, we call them point of care troponin. As far as getting it more accurately, we've tried things. We've tried, the machine learning approach, but it's not really making much of a difference, and I'm a bit skeptical that we will be able to get much of a difference. And that's because people are so biologically different. When you measure the troponin really matters. You don't want to measure it too soon after somebody says it hurts, or too late, because it rises and fluctuates. And believe it or not, the definition of a heart attack itself is a bit arbitrary, because they use thresholds of this biomarker and say, oh, if it's above, it could be a heart attack. If it's below, it can't be. Yeah, I think the future, I would hope, is that we'll be able to find out in the ED those people who are really going to benefit from having a stent or having some kind of other intervention.
Uh, 8 years ago, after a heart bypass operation at Christchurch Public Hospital, I was told that New Zealand had the best survival rate, that is the number of patients who were admitted to hospital with a heart problem, the highest percentage of people still alive after 30 days.
Yep.
New Zealand had the best score in the world, and that within New Zealand, Christchurch was the best place to be.
Yeah.
Do you think that's still the case?
Oh, I'm just going to accept your word on that. I really, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I haven't looked at those numbers, so I couldn't judge it.
Hi, what do you think of like monitoring technologies like ECGs and Apple Watches as far as improving cardiac outcomes for people?
Yeah, there are other cardiac type of things where people's heart races or slows right down, those kind of things. Pacemakers, obviously, people have. I think some of that will eventually get good enough to be helpful. The difficulty is if it became so ubiquitous that you get lots and lots of false positives, and then all you do is end up having more people in ED or somewhere unnecessarily. So I think there's work to be done yet on that.
Hey, you showed the ED presentations increasing over time, but do you think that's population or general health cost of living, people avoiding GPs?
Yeah, I think it's multifactorial. There's certainly population, but if you ask the people who turn up, it appears more and more people are not able to get to see their GPs because there's not enough GPs. And so their choices become more limited, 24-hour surgery, sometimes ED.
We have time for one or two more questions, if there's anyone in the back or over here. Okay.
The side is nice.
Thanks. Those boxes, would they be available like at GPs and paramedics as well in the future?
Yeah, definitely. We've already done some work with GPs in rural areas where they, an earlier generation type of boxes, in which we managed to reduce the transfers from out somewhere in rural Waikato to Hamilton by 50%. Now with these new boxes, people won't have to hang around the GPs for hours and hours. So that's the hope, and we've got a program that we're rolling out actually this year and over next year, in which we're actually going to test to see if it makes a difference, because that's science. You know, your ideas can be great, but you've still got to test them in the field. Yeah, and paramedics, maybe the only thing with troponin is if you measure it too early, you don't see it. It takes time to gather up in the blood, a few hours.
Did COVID increase the presentation of cardiac arrests and affect the results of the study?
I haven't looked at the presentation rate. Certainly the measurement of troponin increased, especially in young people, because people started to worry about myocarditis, which is quite high in COVID. It's much lower with vaccines, much lower, but people still wanted to check. So it's a bit hard to separate that stuff out, but I don't know if there's any numbers about heart attack rates.
Thank you so much, John. That's all we have time for now. Everyone give John a round of applause.